Hello and welcome back to Parc Fermé Parlay with Kieran Downey. It is the morning after the night before. I had originally planned on recording this straight after the Canadian Grand Prix, but it took 5.5 hours for them to get the final classification sorted because they were dealing with that many investigations and a protest to the race result. And I just quite frankly wasn't going to wait that long because by the time the race finished and I'd compiled all my notes and, the decisions from the stewards started coming in, it was well after 10 o'clock and I was tired. So it is 10 to 6 in the morning here and we are here for our race review. As I said, it took 5.5 hours for us to get the final race result. And that is purely down to a protest launched by Red Bull against the race result. Now, I'll come on and talk a little bit more about this when we come on and talk about George and about Max Verstappen, but Red Bull lodged a protest in two parts. One against George Russell driving erratically behind the safety car, him braking on that pit straight. And part two was Russell dropping too far behind the safety car. Now, the stewards had been going through everything from Ocon driving erratically in the pit lane, Stroll forcing another driver off the track, 7 drivers getting safety car infringements. That all got dealt with pretty quickly, and then it was a long wait for the stewards to sort of deal with this protest. And I have to say that 5.5 hours for the FIA to give us this final race result is far too long. The fact that the governing body has taken 5.5 hours after the checkered flag to give us the final race result is absurd, especially for a sport at this level. Now, this isn't a dig at Red Bull. They're well within their rights to lodge a protest. They thought they had something. That's not what I'm getting at. What I'm getting at is there is clearly something not working right, that it is taking this long for the FIA to get through everything. At the best of times, it's an incredibly complex and convoluted situation when these things happen, and obviously tonight is a clear example of that, but it's just highlighted that there is clearly something that's not quite working right, and there definitely needs to be some kind of investment and updating to how these situations are handled, because as I said, it's not a good look for a sport at this level to take 5.5, nearly 6 hours to give us a final result after the checkered flag. All right, now let's get into the thick of it with the drivers, and as always kicking off with Kick Sauber and Gabriel Bortoleto, who qualified 16th, started 15th, finished 14th, and Nico Hülkenberg, that qualified 13th, started 11th, finished 8th. Now, for pretty much every driver on the grid, bar a few, there is some kind of movement for the starting position due to penalties and pit lane starts being handed out. So that's why there's quite a bit of movement there. In terms of the qualifying, nothing terrible, just didn't have the pace. They just didn't have the pace to get through. It was an incredibly difficult qualifying and quite a difficult race. The tyre deg was high. The mechanical grip on the cars was low. They were sliding about everywhere. Throughout the entire weekend, drivers up and down the grid, from pretty poor performing cars to some of the best performing cars, really struggled for finding the mechanical grip, trying to keep the rear of the car from stepping out because they were sliding all over the place. So unfortunately for Hülkenberg and Bortoleto, just didn't really have the pace, and it was quite a difficult qualifying session. What I will say for both of these drivers is I actually think they ran incredibly good races, like Hülkenberg scoring some more points. Bortoleto went incredibly long on his first stint. I think he was 40 plus laps before he pitted, and that's no mean feat, especially because the tyre deg was so high on these tyres. So I think it's an incredibly good race for both of them. Again, sort of linking into that thing with Bortoleto, where he's maybe not lighting up the timesheets, he's maybe not scoring a heap of points, but he is performing pretty well in that car. And Hülkenberg is just continuing to perform pretty well. That's a good couple of races. He's had some pretty good point scoring finishes this year, and I am really enjoying this Hülkenberg renaissance that we're having. It's just such a pleasure to see that man race and score points. He's doing a very good job in quite average machinery. So yeah, a decent result from Sauber. Moving on to Williams, and we have Alex Albon, who qualified 10th, started 9th, did not finish, and Carlos Sainz, who qualified 17th, started 16th, finished 10th. Williams were all over the place this weekend. This was not a good weekend for them at all. Like, yes, Carlos has scored a point, but when you look at the whole weekend, it was a little bit chaotic for Williams. Right from the jump in Q1, Alex Albon losing his engine cover in one of the most bizarre instances I've ever seen in my life. I remember watching it on the broadcast and being like, what the hell has happened to Albon's engine cover? It was just gone. And I thought, has he had an accident? But for it to be an accident and have that happen, surely he wouldn't still be driving the car. And then the replays came and it looked like the engine cover it looked like his car blew up because the engine cover just went boom and it was just gone. And I just couldn't really understand what was happening. And it's come out since then that some air had gotten underneath the engine cover and just blew it off, which, how that happened, I have no idea. It's just wild that that can happen. Like, these cars are usually pretty secure and it usually takes some kind of force for that to happen, and for air to get underneath the engine cover and blow off like that is a pretty mental thing to happen. Then we have Carlos Sainz being impeded by Isaac Hadjar in his final runs of Q1, his final flying run of Q1, which lost him about 0.3, I think it was, of a second, which is actually what knocked him out of Q1. If he hadn't been impeded, he would probably have gotten through. An incredibly unfortunate incident. Hadjar did get a penalty for it. He was told by the team that Sainz wasn't on a push lap anymore, when in fact Sainz was, and just didn't get out of the way for Carlos Sainz coming through behind him. So a bit of an unfortunate incident, but it's just Formula One. You know, you get impeded by another car, not actually your fault. You can't get the lap time in, and you suffer for it. I mean, so did Hadjar. He got a penalty, but it is what it is. Moving into the race, I actually thought that Albon was going to get a bit of a penalty on that opening lap. He was coming round the outside of... I think he was coming round the outside of Colapinto through turn 8 and ran wide. The car was bouncing. He got pushed wide onto the grass. The car was leaping about over that grass runoff. Like, it was a bit crazy to see. I imagine he probably felt that through his whole body, just how violently that car was leaping over the grass. And he rejoined, and it was very, very close to there being an incident. We'd actually seen a rejoin very similar to that happening in the F1 Academy race that caused a collision. I actually thought the stewards would look at that and give him a bit of a penalty for rejoining the track in an unsafe condition, but actually I think they just put it all down to a lap 1 racing incident. I did think the stewards would be a little bit... I thought they would take a little bit of a harsher stance to it. It was, you know, we were a bit further into the race. It wasn't like a lap 1, turn 1 incident. We were down sort of the back end of the track. So I did think that the stewards would have something to say about it, but they nothing ever came through. We obviously all talk about the relationship between Lewis Hamilton and his race engineer Riccardo Adami, and we like to highlight it, but I actually think one of the most terse relationships in Formula One is between Alex Albon and Williams, the Williams strategy team. He just cannot see eye to eye with them this year, and it's really getting highlighted through his radio messages. Like, he's just never happy with them. It seems like every race weekend we're getting some kind of radio message from Albon where he's like, you guys just don't listen to me. It's really beginning to annoy me. And he really pushes back at anything the team want him to do, and he goes into trying to create his own strategies. There was an issue with that car and he did have to retire later. We'll come on to that slightly in a second, but Williams didn't want to have him on a one-stop. Albon really wanted to be on a one-stop, so Williams kind of reworked everything, but he was out there on tyres. I think he was on the medium tyres to begin with, and he was hurting so much. Like, he was just losing time to all the drivers. Couple that with a PU issue that he was facing, which is very similar to Barcelona. He was just a sitting duck. There was zero pace in the car at this point, and he was just losing positions. They push him incredibly hard. They get him on a one-stop, and when he's back out, he's dead last. He's obviously pissed off at this, and what he can't see is the amount of drivers ahead of him that are still yet to pit or have to pit again. So if he's on a one-stop, he can gain track position through that. And James Vowles even said to Sky Sports, he was like, you know, Alex can't quite see it yet, but we're doing this to benefit him. You know, there's a lot of cars in front of him that have yet to pit or need to pit again. And through that, the race will come to him. The track position will come to him that way. But he can't quite see it yet. And then they had to retire the car. Albon went off at turn 10. He pulled in behind the safety barrier down that escape road. So there was no interruptions to the race. But that's again, for the second race week in a row, that there's issues with that power unit. And actually, it's a Mercedes power unit. So that's not actually the second week in a row, because Kimi Antonelli, using the same power unit, retired in Imola. George Russell then was out in Q2 with a PU issue in Monaco. Antonelli then had to retire again with a PU issue in Barcelona. Albon retired with a PU issue in Barcelona and has retired again with a PU issue in Canada. So there's something with that Mercedes power unit that's not quite working. When you think about it, it's actually quite scary considering how many cars are using that Mercedes power unit. Obviously, Mercedes, Williams, and the championship leaders, McLaren, they cannot afford to have that power unit begin to fail them. You know, the constructors, they've kind of got a bit of leeway because they've got such a gap in there, but those two drivers cannot afford to start retiring from races with PU problems, with power unit issues. So whatever the issue is with that Mercedes engine, they're going to have to get it sorted pretty quickly, because that's 4 race weekends in a row that there's been an issue with that Mercedes engine across 2 different teams. So that's not looking great. Carlos Sainz obviously had a bit of a better race. He was one of the drivers that went incredibly long on that first stint, 40 laps plus. But I actually think it was around lap 58 that Sainz pitted. And thankfully for him, he'd gone so long on those tyres that there was gaps had created sort of up and down. In fact, actually at one point, the front runners were lapping the back markers, and around 80% of the drivers were all on one part of the track. And then there was like a couple on the other side. So he'd built himself up a nice little bit of a gap, managed to get the pit stop in, hadn't lost too many positions because he'd gone so long on those tyres, then had such a huge tyre offset to quite a lot of the other drivers that he could get some overtaking and stuff done. Finishing 10th, thank God he managed to score a point, so it's not all completely gone for Williams this weekend. He did get noted for driving erratically, both he and Ocon, but it was no further action there. Again, just another weekend that's not gone the way Williams will have wanted, and there's some issues there that need sorted out. The communication between Albon and the team, that all needs fixed. The stuff with the Mercedes power units and the engines, that needs looked at and sort of tied down to make sure that this isn't really happening again. And just building faith back in the car for Albon will be a bit of an issue, because they were running pretty decently at one point and it kind of has fallen away from them just a little bit. All right, moving on to VCarb and Liam Lawson, who qualified 19th, started from the pit lane, did not finish, and Isaac Hadjar, who qualified 9th, started 12th, finished 16th. Lawson actually started from the pit lane. He'd originally taken a 50-place grid penalty for changing 5 parts on his power unit, and I think about 3 of those parts were actually his 5th in his allotment for parts for the year. The changing of each of those parts carried with it a 10-place grid penalty, so it was 50 places altogether, which meant he would just automatically start at the back of the grid. But because those changes and changes to the suspension were made breaking Parc Fermé, it was an automatic pit lane start for Lawson. Never really made an impression. Neither really did Hadjar. They never really managed to climb too far up the pack. They were always sort of at the back of the drivers. Lawson ended up retiring the car. They had to protect the power unit. So something not quite right there. There didn't seem to be any issues on track, and the radio message came through, box retire, and then the radio messages came to say, I'm really sorry, mate, but we have to protect this power unit. The team's clearly just flying through these power unit elements on this car, which is not good, because we're only on race 10 or race 11. We're only on race 10, and some of the parts he's using is his 5th in his allotment, so they need to be careful, and I can see why they've retired the car. It is one of those races where you can sort of get yourself stuck in a DRS train. And with that, being in the dirty air of the car in front, you begin to overheat your engine, and that's obviously never good for the car. So I can see why they've just pulled him out of the race to protect that. There was obviously something that they were seeing that just wasn't looking quite right, and rather than run any risks, just pull the car. Again, Isaac Hadjar just wasn't ever really there. It was just a bit of an unfortunate weekend for Isaac Hadjar. Had an alright qualifying, getting into Q3 again, which I'm loving to see, but did take a 3-place grid penalty for impeding Carlos Sainz in Q1. Completely the team's fault again. It doesn't really seem fair that Hadjar has to take the penalty when it's the team's issue, giving him the wrong information, but I've said it before and I'll say it again, any penalty against the driver is a penalty against the team because it does affect their championship points at the end of the day. He obviously ended up starting 12th, and then when it came to the race, never really there, always kind of at the back of the pack, didn't really manage to make an impression, probably struggled with the incredibly high tyre deg, couldn't really put an attack in because he had to manage his tyres so much. This was a race of tyre management, so a bit unfortunate for Hadjar. Hopefully he can sort of bounce back in the races to come. Next up is Haas and Esteban Ocon, who qualified 15th, started 14th, finished 9th, and Ollie Behrman, who qualified 14th, started 13th, finished 11th. To be honest, I think a lot of Haas's poor performance this weekend can be tied up to just not really having the pace. They didn't have the pace in qualifying, that's why they were out where they were. They didn't have huge amounts of pace in the car. You know, their race pace, compared to their quality pace, their race pace is a lot better in terms of the distance. You know, long runs is where the Haas really sort of comes alive and the drivers kind of come alive with the car. But unfortunately for Behrman, just wasn't really the race for him. Ocon, pretty decent, being able to score a couple of points. They did both get noted by the stewards. Ocon was for driving erratically in the pit lane. That was no further action. And Behrman was noted for rejoining the track incorrectly, using the escape roads incorrectly. He received a warning for that. So a bit of a mixed bag weekend for Haas. As I said, the pace wasn't really there. Ocon did a brilliant job to score the points he did. He was one of the drivers that went incredibly long on that first stint. Again, that sort of 40 laps plus on that initial hard tyre, gaining track position that way, and that really sort of benefited him in the end, managing to get P9 and some points in the bag. But not a great weekend for Behrman, not the worst. And you know, in terms of the championship, they are fighting VCarb, and VCarb not managing to score any points, Ocon managing to score 2 points. That has put them neck and neck in the championship, so it's not all for nothing. And they'll be hoping to, you know, maybe capitalise a bit more in the coming races to kind of increase that gap a little bit. Moving on to Alpine, and we have Pierre Gasly, who qualified 20th, started from the pit lane, finished 15th, and Franco Colapinto, who qualified 12th, started 10th, finished 13th. Gasly's qualifying was an absolute shocker, to be honest with you. Qualifying 20th, dead last on the road, massively outperformed by Franco Colapinto, who hasn't seemed to be at one with the car all weekend. You know, Colapinto was spinning throughout the majority of the sessions, is quite a shocker. And this is nothing against Gasly, to be fair. Unfortunately, just didn't have the pace in the car to hook up a faster lap. And there was only 0.8 seconds splitting the entire field in Q1. Less than a second split all 20 drivers in Q1. So it's the smallest of margins that Gasly's missed out on, but it's still dead last P20. Gasly then started from the pit lane because the team broke Parc Fermé to make changes to the car. Gasly went incredibly long on his first stint, didn't really pay off for him. You know, it's still 15th on the road. You know, we had 3 DNFs, even though Lando was actually classified, but it just wasn't the best race, to be honest, for Pierre Gasly. Again, so much of this race was just tyre management that there was actually not a whole load of attacking apart from those sort of front runners and the odd battle at the back. Just not a great weekend for Gasly. For Colapinto, you know, this is race 4 out of the promised 5 that Colapinto has since replacing Jack Doohan. And listen, I am under no illusions that after Austria, Colapinto is going to be out of the car. I fully am under the impression and believe that Colapinto is in that car now until, the season end. I don't think Briatore is going to kick him out of the car. I don't think anyway. But in these 4 races, we just haven't seen the performance that we've been expecting. You know, we obviously watched Colapinto last year in Williams and were incredibly impressed by the performances he was having out on track. Yes, he had a little period of time where he was a little bit crash happy, but on the whole, we were all seriously impressed and we were all wanting him to get a seat for this year. Not really the way he managed to get it, but we all wanted him to get a seat. In these 4 races he's had, he's not really gelled with the car. You can tell he's not really feeling at one with the Alpine yet. That might come. I've seen a lot of people say, well, he's not performing any better than Jack Doohan was, so is it time for them to get Colapinto out the car? And to be honest with you, Alpine can't really afford to do that. They can't just keep rotating through a load of drivers. They're only allowed to use so many drivers throughout a season, so they have to really sort of stick and make it work with Colapinto, unless they decide to go back to Doohan, which I can't imagine they will. I also don't think we can really judge it at this point. I think it's too early for us to say either way about Colapinto. It's been 4 races, and I understand that that was roughly about the same amount of time that Jack Doohan was given. You know, he was given 6 races and then got punted. I also don't think that was enough time. I don't think Alpine can do anything about it other than try and work through it with Colapinto. They can't just keep giving these drivers 5-6 races and then kicking them to the curb because they're not performing. Of course they're not performing. They're not getting a chance. Listen, the Alpine's not the easiest car to drive, and I think if there was any conversations happening at Alpine that if Colapinto doesn't perform decently in Austria in 2 weeks' time, he's getting booted, I think that's absolute insanity. You cannot judge his performance on the 5 races he's had. He's never driven the Alpine before. He's done a couple of tests in previous cars doing TPCs, but it's nothing major that will get him ready to compete in that car. They cannot do anything about it. They have to just work at it with Colapinto, unless they swap him back for Jack Doohan, which again, I just can't see them doing. But as I said, within these 4 races that Colapinto's had, he hasn't really managed to gel with that car. I do think it will come, but the performance is not there and it's not what we've really been expecting. But as I said, I'm kind of trying to play devil's advocate here. It's too early for us to judge whether or not he should remain in that car. He has to stay in it till the end of the year now. Alpine don't really have another choice. Although knowing Flavio Briatore, they'll probably do something mental. Next up is Aston Martin and Fernando Alonso, who qualified 6th, started 6th, finished 7th, and Lance Stroll, who qualified 18th, started 17th, finished 17th. I was actually a little bit worried for Alonso, to be quite honest, when he was one of the quite early pitters in the race. His pit stop was quite early and it was quite a slow stop. And then, you know, his final few laps, the deg was high, he was losing positions, it all really wasn't working for him. And then when he came out the pits, he was so, like, all the track position he'd managed to get through quali had just gone. And I thought, well, that's it. Yes, this is quite an easy track to overtake on. It's high speed, high braking. You can end up in a bit of a DRS train, which we've seen in the opening stages of this race. But there is overtaking opportunities. But I just really worried that he was never really going to sort of get back up the order. Thankfully, he did and got P6. And that's 2 weeks on the trot now that Fernando Alonso has scored points. I think it was a great race for Fernando Alonso and long may they continue. The opening stages of this year have been brutal for Alonso. Brutal. To the point that he just looked a little bit broken. And, you know, he's coming over the radio calling himself the most unlucky driver in the world. It was savage watching him, and it was quite depressing, especially when they brought the upgrades to the car and the car's performance was there. It just wasn't happening for him. Like, nothing seemed to go Alonso's way, and I was just incredibly concerned that he was going to have a pointless campaign. But P6, it's a P9 and a P6, so we're getting points in the bag. You know, he's no longer on 0 points with the Jack Doohans and the Gabriel Bortoletos and Franco Colapintos. He's sitting 16th now. He's ahead of Behrman. He's ahead of Lawson, who have both got points. Like, let's just keep climbing up that order, please, Alonso. I mean, I can't imagine it'll be much longer that if the performance like this continues that he'll be stuck behind Yuki Tsunoda, because that's another quite terse relationship between Yuki and Red Bull at the moment. Speaking of Lance Stroll, something was going on this weekend with Lance Stroll, and it was all very, very bizarre, to be quite honest with you. Now, obviously, Lance had a second procedure on his wrists. He obviously pulled out of the Spanish Grand Prix after the qualifying session due to pain in his wrists that was linked to the surgery that he got back in 2023 after, I think it was a biking accident. He got another surgery. I didn't think he'd be competing this weekend, but the statement came out and said, you know, Stroll will be there. He's feeling good. The weekend just kind of unraveled for him a little bit. He had a crash in FP2, which, regardless of whether he was feeling 100% or not, will not have helped the situation with his wrists anymore. I don't know whether the pain in his wrists were a reason for that, because looking at the replays, he understeered going into the corner and kissed the barrier. I mean, I would probably say it was a bit more than a kiss, it was more of a clap. The impact was actually a bit too heavy and his whole front left suspension just broke. The wheel was like, not today, just... He actually wanted to try and bring the car back, and the team had to come over the radio and be like, no, park the car. And Lance is like, it'll be fine, I can get it back to the pits. And they're like, no, it's against the rules, park the car. And he came off at the turn 10 hairpin and parked up there, and that was him done for FP2. And listen, I don't know what the reasons for him tapping the barrier were. It does really seem like more than a coincidence that he's had surgery on his wrists and, you know, he's had a bit of an accident this weekend. The whole situation was just a little bit suspicious. You know, he spent a lot of the press conference with, you know, not really addressing any questions about it and hiding his wrists away. And I understand that it's obviously maybe a bit of a sensitive topic, and I understand that Lance isn't the most talkative person at times, especially in these press conferences, but my God, it was the man's home race and he could not have looked less interested if he tried. He looked like he would rather be anywhere else than at that racetrack. It's bizarre to me, and I understand that everybody's personalities are different and we all handle situations differently and all that kind of stuff, but there was just nothing from Lance Stroll this whole weekend, and it was just all a bit bizarre. We then get to qualifying, and it's an incredibly poor quali. He's P18 when his teammate Alonso is sitting P6. He then doesn't make any impression throughout the entire race, and then gets a 10-second penalty for forcing Gasly off the track. Coming down that back straight, Gasly went for the overtake. Stroll pushes him off onto the grass verge, doesn't leave a car's width, gets a 10-second penalty, them's the rules. It was just an incredibly strange weekend for Lance Stroll, and there just seemed to be something amiss. And listen, I don't know whether it was to do with his wrists, and there's still pain there. I imagine there is. You know, there is photos of him arrived. He's still got bandages around his wrists. So there's obviously still some kind of pain, pressure, I don't know. There's something still not feeling quite right there for him. Obviously, he's just had surgery. The pain will probably only have gotten worse through the crash in FP2. But just everything about Lance Stroll this weekend was just a bit of an enigma. Right, next up, Mercedes. And we have George Russell, who qualified first, started first, finished first. And Kimi Antonelli, who qualified fourth, started fourth, finished third. It was a near perfect weekend for George Russell. As close, maybe not as close to perfect in terms of Formula One standards, but pretty damn close. He was, when it mattered, on fire. That quali lap was sensational. Absolutely came out of nowhere. We all kind of expected that Mercedes would perform pretty well around this track. You know, they deal better in the cooler conditions, and this was kind of a situation that was suited to that car. But I did not expect Russell to get pole the margin that he did with such a sensational lap. It was absolutely incredible. And his race was also just incredible. You know, it was a clean turn one for him. He didn't crumble to the pressure that Verstappen was putting him in those opening laps, because Verstappen would not let up. He would not He was clung to the back of that Mercedes like his life depended on it. And Russell just kept his cool, kept doing what he was doing, never really let the pressure get to him. Verstappen did end up pulling back a little bit, and Russell then managed to go and sort of eke out a gap. It was a fantastic drive from Russell. Mercedes' strategy was on point. They responded at the correct time to everything that was going on around them. The team reacted correctly to everything that was happening through the other teams pitting, getting Russell in at the right time to avoid the undercuts, to undercut other drivers. Like, it all just worked out perfectly for them. They made a great choice to bring Russell in when they did towards the end of the race. He was coming up towards the back markers. They were all sort of squabbling amongst themselves. It was the right time to pull him in, get his tyres changed and get him back out. And yes, there was such a huge tyre offset that he would probably be up behind the back markers pretty quickly, which he was. But just to avoid that scrap on old tyres, perfect choice. It was a slow stop. It brought him out behind Leclerc, but he had such a huge tyre offset that it wasn't really any problem in dispatching these drivers, who then also were going into the pits as well. And it actually got to a point that McLaren were coming over the radio and telling Piastri, you know, this fight is with Antonelli and Verstappen. You know, we still had 15 laps or so to go, and McLaren were under the impression that Russell just had this one. He was driving brilliantly out there. Then we got the safety car due to Lando Norris's crash. We were coming down the back straight behind the safety car. Russell quite aggressively hit the brakes, which sort of catapulted Verstappen behind him to just in front of him. And then this is where the games began. Verstappen's over the radio saying Russell is driving erratically, braking aggressively. Russell's over the radio saying Max is trying to overtake him under safety car conditions. It's caused quite a split amongst the fans. Some people were saying, you know, George was driving erratically, that he should be penalised for it. He's breaking the sporting regulations. I actually had somebody in my comments stating the exact wording of the article within the International Sporting Code of that regulation about erratic driving behind the safety car and braking and everything like that. Part of the protest that Red Bull launched was to do with the gap that he was creating to the safety car. All I'm going to say on this one is that it's clear that there was no issue, purely down to the fact that Russell hasn't received any penalty or warning or anything from the stewards. Race Control didn't even note the incident to send it to the stewards. They didn't think there to be any issue whatsoever there. It's kind of the end of the story.
Hi, Edit and Kieran here. I was just thinking about this, and regardless of whether George was at fault or not, whether he was brake testing Max, all that kind of stuff, one, I think it is a bit mental to slam on the brakes so aggressively to try and cause your rival to overtake you behind the safety car, so you can immediately come over the radio to say he's overtaking me under the safety car conditions, so that he potentially will get penalty points and get a race ban. If that is the case, that is absolute insanity. That is absolutely insane. And if that is the case, George has lost his fucking mind. What I will also say to this is, I do think there is a bit of a double standard here, because had it been roles reversed and Max had slammed the brakes on and everything like that, I do think Max would have gotten a penalty for this. I do think that had Max been in George's shoes and George been Max, and Max done what George did, the stewards would have handled it completely differently, and Max probably would have gotten a penalty for it. That being said, I guess we'll never actually know what George was doing, because he's never going to admit it, and it'll probably just live and die on that day. But I do genuinely think that had the roles been reversed, it would be a very different situation, and we would be sat here talking about Max's penalty, not the stewards not doing anything to Russell. So then, is there really a problem?
Now, Red Bull obviously launched the protest, as I mentioned earlier, against George Russell and the race win. And as I said, it was in two parts. Part one was Russell driving erratically and braking so aggressively behind the safety car. And part two was Russell dropping quite a distance behind the safety car. Red Bull said that George Russell's braking was erratic and unnecessary. They also said that he showed unsportsmanlike behaviour towards Verstappen over the radio. The stewards obviously didn't deem it to be anything and just threw the whole thing out. I will say that whilst it's 100% in their right to lodge these protests. I'm not against Red Bull doing the protest at all. Well within their right, go for it. What I will say is it's a little bit rich of Red Bull to go after George for unsportsmanlike behaviour, considering how Max behaved a couple of weeks ago. That's all I'm going to say. All I'm going to say on the matter. I know that there's been comments and jokes made in the lead up to this race. George saying, I've got a few more points on my licence to play with. Even Martin Brundle goading on the other drivers to force Verstappen into some kind of situation that would grant him an extra penalty point so that he gets a race ban. The whole situation has just gone a bit too far. And all of these kind of things that have happened, Russell making these kind of comments, the media's fascination on the whole thing, Martin Brundle saying those things has fed into people that already don't like Russell hating on him on the internet, calling him disingenuous and an asshole and everything like that. Can we just let it be at this point? The stewards don't deem it to be anything. They didn't give Russell any penalties. They threw out the Red Bull protest. Can we all just take the tinfoil hats off for a second? The unnecessary spew that comes out of some people towards these drivers is just a bit too much. It makes no difference to anything what has happened here. It made no difference to the race result. It's made no difference to either driver. It's made no difference to any of us as fans. Can we all just chill out? Now, moving on to something a little bit more positive, Kimi goddamn Antonelli getting his first podium of the season. Oh, I'm so happy for the kid. I'm so happy for him. He's had a great weekend. It was a decent qualifying session. He handled himself brilliantly during that race. And it did get a little bit tense towards the end. And I actually found myself wanting, which actually kind of came a little bit true, wanting the two McLaren drivers just to continue their battle to allow Antonelli just to get a bit further up the road. Piastri was gaining on Antonelli quite quickly, but Norris, thankfully, was gaining on Piastri even quicker. And their squabble sort of allowed Antonelli to pull away a little bit. Two McLarens came back in behind Antonelli, and I have to say, I agree with Nico Rosberg, because he was singing Antonelli's praises after the race with how clever Antonelli is, that at this point in a race when he's probably a little bit tired, as we all would be, he's under pressure from both of these drivers who are literally side by side coming down the back straight. For Antonelli to look in his mirrors and see it happening and say, right, for my race, who would I rather have behind me? Which McLaren driver being behind me will give me a bit more of a benefit? Knowing that it would be Oscar Piastri and giving Piastri the slipstream so that Piastri can stay ahead of Norris to then benefit him is phenomenal. The guy was on fire. Like, it was amazing. And as I said, I found myself just wanting the two McLaren drivers to continue fighting just so that Antonelli could sort of eke out a bit of a gap and get that first podium in. I didn't expect them to crash, but thank God, I'm so happy for Kimi Antonelli on that podium. It was such a good surprise I did not expect coming into this weekend. I'm so glad he got his first podium. He's now like the third youngest driver, I think, to ever step on a podium in Formula One. I just absolutely loved it. Loved every second of it. Well done, Kimi Antonelli, and I cannot wait for his first win. Do I think it'll come this year? Formula One, anything could happen. We could see Kimi Antonelli winning a race this year, and I would love that. Moving on to Red Bull, and we have Yuki Tsunoda, who qualified 11th, started 18th, finished 12th. And Max Verstappen, who qualified second, started second, finished second. Now for Yuki, I feel a bit sorry for the lad because he got a 10-place grid penalty for overtaking under red flag conditions during FP2, or was it FP3? It was one of the practice sessions. I think it was FP3. He got a 10-place grid penalty for overtaking Oscar Piastri, who caused the red flag. Piastri had had a bit of an accident in FP3. He had a rear puncture. His front suspension was broken and it caused the red flag. Now, he was able to limp back to the pits, and coming down the back straight, Yuki Tsunoda was coming up behind him. Obviously, Piastri was driving slower. Yuki didn't deem it to be entirely safe to be around the back of Piastri, to be sitting behind Piastri coming down this straight. So drove past Piastri to come back to the pits. Now, the stewards didn't deem that to be any reason as to why Tsunoda overtook Piastri under red flag conditions. The stewards looked at the speed of both the drivers, they looked at the damage on Piastri's car and didn't deem there to be any dangerous reasons that would grant Yuki the right to overtake under a red flag condition. I do think that there is certain mitigating circumstances, and if the car that you are going to be overtaking is, broken, is the reason that you've got a red flag, has a puncture, the suspension on the car is broken, is going slower, I do reckon that there should be a bit of a mitigating circumstance to allow the drivers to go past them. The stewards obviously don't deem it that way. They gave him a 10th place penalty, so I did feel quite bad for him. It did mean that he started dead last on the road, but with a couple of pit lane starts, he ended up starting 18th, still dead last. I will say it was a pretty decent race for Tsunoda. He went to lap 57 on those hard tyres. It did kind of seem like Red Bull had forgotten about him, but obviously they hadn't. And it did pay him back. He, finished 12th. It's no points, unfortunately, but I would say on the whole, not a bad race for Tsunoda, and there's promising signs there. And it is unfortunate that his qualifying was ruined by a 10th place penalty, because had he started 11th, there is every chance that he could have scored some points yesterday. And it is a bit of a shame that it's, again, another pointless weekend for Tsunoda. He's struggling with the car. He's not having the best times out there, and a weekend where he could have scored some points, it's unfortunate that he didn't. For Verstappen, he was lightning through that qualifying session, and unfortunately just George Russell answered the call when needed and pulled out an absolutely sensational lap to get himself on pole. After the quali came all of the questions, obviously, from the press and everyone about, George and Max starting on the front row 2 weeks after their tiff in Barcelona. What will happen? And these two have started on the front row before. It's a sort of ongoing feud between the two. What's the next part of the story? And Max Verstappen was just not having any of it in that post-quali press conference. He was not bothered a fuck to answer any of the questions. There was a question came to say about Max's penalty points and, the potential race ban looming over him. What will happen? And Max was just like, I'm not answering this question. You guys ask it on a Thursday. It's been 2 weeks now. It's boring, and I'm ready to move on. I'm not going to talk about it. It just pisses me off, is his exact words. I kind of feel two ways about it. One, I fully agree with Max Verstappen. I'm fully on board with it. I do think that we linger on certain topics way after they're sort of done. With this penalty situation, we discussed it in Barcelona. We have been discussing it for 2 weeks now. We will have discussed it all through the media day on Thursday. It'll have been brought up all throughout the Friday, throughout the practice sessions, everything like that. All we've spoken about. Then it comes to the quali press conference, and we're still talking about it. We'll probably still be talking about Max's penalty points next week when we get to Austria, before 2 are scrubbed off. And he can still get a race ban next week. Or in 2 weeks' time, sorry. So I understand Max's frustrations in the media really just hanging and lingering on these stories. However, what really does Max expect? It is a huge storyline. It's a big story within the sport at the moment that the current World Drivers' Champion could get a race ban, and that is huge for Formula One. It's huge for Red Bull that is even a possibility that he could get a race ban. He's obviously lining up alongside the driver that their incident got him 2 penalty points, 1 away from a race ban. So what does Max really expect from the media? Of course they're going to ask about it. On the flip side of that, did the media really expect that Max is going to answer these questions? Because I don't expect him to answer these questions. And I know that, they have to ask it, otherwise they're not doing their jobs. But there's no way Max is going to answer these questions. Of course he's going to have that reaction. Do you know what I mean? It's Max Verstappen. He hates this whole media circus anyway. He just wants to go out there and drive the car. He doesn't care to answer these questions. We've seen it before. He's just not answered any questions at all and then had his own little private press conference because he's so over playing the games. So I see it from both sides. And then when it came to the race start, we'd built it up so much. It was turn one, is there going to be fireworks? And oh my God, it could all go mental at turn one. That was one of the cleanest turn ones I've seen this year, I think. Generally one of the cleanest lights out lap one, turn one I think I've ever seen this year. Business is normal, all got through fine, off we go. It was so clean. And it was so clean and actually just a little bit anticlimactic. What I will say is Max did an incredibly good job out there, despite really struggling. He was struggling with the tyre deck, struggling with the grip. Did kind of seem like maybe it would fall away from him a little bit, but you can never count Max Verstappen out. I can't, I've said that so many times, but I cannot believe how many times it was said by various different people again and again and again and again and again across the broadcast this weekend. Like every third sentence out of somebody's mouth was, well, you can't count out Max Verstappen, which you can't, but we've said it once, we've said it a million times. But yeah, a very good race from Verstappen, kept it pretty much clean throughout the whole thing. There wasn't any real moments where we were like, is he going to get a race ban? He kept his nose clean, apart from that one little incident with George Russell at the end, but that obviously meant nothing. And the stewards didn't even bother to look into it. So yeah, a very good race from Max Verstappen. Speaking of Ferrari, we have Lewis Hamilton, who qualified 5th, started 5th, finished 6th, and Charles Leclerc, who qualified 8th, started 8th, finished 5th. What a bit of a roller coaster for Charles Leclerc, crashing into the wall in FP1. It meant he missed the majority of FP1 and all of FP2. You could see how dusty the track was. As soon as he missed the turning point, it was just dust everywhere. And all of my time watching Formula One and watching Canadian Grand Prix, I don't think I've ever seen anybody crash into that barrier. I will say that Leclerc does have a tendency to sort of push that car incredibly hard at points where maybe it's not required. And unfortunately, it did hurt him. It left both he and Ferrari on the back foot, majorly on the back foot going into the rest of the weekend. We then get to qualifying. He's on an absolute flyer. He does look like he's in for a shot at pole position. And there's just a bit of a mistake. Snap of oversteer coming through turns 6 and 7, I believe it was, that just absolutely ruined his shot, ruined his lap, meant he qualified 8th. And I thought, well, that's it. It's over. Then get to the race, and through some quite early pits, he manages to gain some positions and get a bit further up the grid. And then the fucking ABCs of strategy come out from Ferrari, and this is where it just begins to lose me a little bit. They just open themselves up for a bit of a disaster. The team fully commit to one strategy. It seems without actually listening to Leclerc, how he's feeling on his tyres, how he's feeling at this part of the race. And what I will say to sort of devil's advocate a little bit is Leclerc can only see what's happening around him, whereas the team can see what's happening throughout the entirety of the track with all of the drivers, so they can sort of bigger picture the race. I do just think that they don't actually listen to anything Leclerc says. He was feeling good on his tyres. I do think Leclerc could have stopped it. The team committed him without actually really consulting him that much to a 2-stop. They brought him in and stuck him on a hard tyre again, which automatically put him to a 2-stop because he had to use 2 different tyre compounds. If they had left him out there and really sent him long on those original hard tyres, got him through that graining phase, let the tyres come back to him, is what happens with so many other drivers, he could have pitted, gone on to the mediums, which is a tyre that he even said he was good on. He was like, I'm good on the medium. Why would you not leave me out longer to get me a 1-stop, get me on a medium with such a tyre offset to everyone else, and let me go and attack? And it does just feel like it was a bit of a wasted opportunity to put him on hard and then hard. Committing him to a 2-stop, not really taking into account particularly just how well Leclerc was doing on those original hard tyres. All that being said, towards the end of the race, he was beginning to hurt a little bit on those medium tyres. You know, he was told to lift and coast and probably didn't. He hates being told to do that. Every time he gets told to do that, he pretty much just says no. But yeah, I'll say it's a decent race for Charles Leclerc. I think fifth is kind of the best we can ask for at the moment. I mean, obviously, I can say all these things about potentially could have been higher up the grid if they'd listened to him and gone with a different strategy, but coulda, woulda, shoulda, we'll never know. He is, you know, the drivers ahead of him are in faster cars. You know, the McLaren, the Mercedes, and the Red Bull, they are faster. I mean, he would have been sixth had Norris not crashed. So I guess there's that. But I do think that right now that is the best we can ask for. For Lewis Hamilton, it's quite simple. He didn't have huge amounts of pace throughout the qualifying session, was running all right during the race, and hit a groundhog. And actually damaged his car, which was losing like 20 points of downforce, which obviously really affected him, meant he wasn't as quick as what he should have been. That being said, a P6 with those issues is a pretty respectable finish, so well done, Hamilton. He was running completely alone out there at one point. You know, there was like a 5-second gap between him and Leclerc in front, and then there was like a 13-second gap between he and Ocon behind him, so he was just completely in no man's land, just running his own little race for quite a majority of the Grand Prix. But yeah, I'll take a 5-6 from Ferrari. It's actually wild that I'm saying those words, but it's better than being outside the points. At least we're scoring something. And finally, we have McLaren and Oscar Piastri, who qualified third, started third, finished fourth, and Lando Norris, who qualified seventh, started seventh, did not finish, but was actually classified 18th. McLaren was a bit of a weird one for McLaren this weekend. You know, they brought a pretty decent upgrade package to Canada. They had a new nose and new front suspension geometry, amongst other things. The nose was only ran on the Friday. It was a test item, but they did keep the front suspension change on Norris's car, and it was aimed at giving the drivers a bit more confidence under braking, which is an issue that it's an area that Lando Norris has issues with. It looked to be all sort of going in their favour. I did actually think that Lando would get pole at one point. You know, he was the quickest throughout the practice sessions, and it got to Q3, and again, under the pressure, incredibly scruffy. He had his lap time deleted for cutting the final corner. Again, just these Q3 mistakes where he just seems to crumble under the pressure. Canada so far had been great for Lando, and then we get this. And, you know, his engineers having to come over the radio and try and get him to focus and not get, you know, sort of carried away or get too bogged down with the sort of mistakes that he's having. But at the end of the day, he should have been on pole, or he should have been lining up second on the grid. He should not have been seventh. What I will say for Lando is these poor qualifying performances could be his undoing in the championship. If he wants to win the World Drivers' Championship, he cannot be starting seventh for the Grand Prix. He cannot be qualifying seventh. He needs to be starting at the front of the grid, because this is a qualifiers championship. It's a dirty air championship. A lot of these tracks, it's incredibly hard to overtake on. Thankfully, Canada wasn't one of them. Unfortunately, it just all came undone in the end. But he needs to get his qualifying under control. He needs to get his Q3 laps, you know, polished, because he can't afford to be starting P7. Lando's race start was good. He was managing to get through some drivers pretty easily. I will say that there was quite a few of the drivers that just didn't even bother to fight, Fernando Alonso being one in particular. Alonso knew his fight was not with Lando Norris, and when it came to the hairpin, Alonso took the corner a bit wider to allow Norris to get through. He wasn't going to put up a fight. Alonso knew that there was no point in him wasting his time, his energy, and, you know, fuel and everything like that, battling Lando Norris when that's not his fight. Then we get to the final stages of the race, and, you know, McLaren and the Lando's race engineer really had to coax Lando on. Like, Will Josephs was constantly over the radio coaxing Lando to really go and attack Piastri. You know, Piastri had fallen out of the DRS range to Antonelli, and they were over the radio being like, Lando, now is the time, go and attack. Whilst Piastri's not got DRS and you do, go and get the attack done. Lando couldn't really get the move done. Every time he was just a little bit too far out from Piastri to sort of get the attack done. And we did just watch the sort of laps tick over as Lando just tried to get closer and closer to the back of Piastri. And I kind of wondered whether we would get a situation similar to, I think it was Imola, where Lando came over the radio and was like, I'm the quicker driver. I'm not telling you to let me past him, but, you know, I am the quicker driver here. And as I said back then, you're well within your right to do that. I don't know whether they did or not. If they did, they didn't play the radio message. Seems like something they probably would play because it's good for the plot. But, you know, Lando really did take some coaching to get this move done. It all seemed to be working out for them. It was some epic battling down that back straight. Lando had the DRS, Oscar had DRS. They were side by side. Obviously, Antonelli giving Oscar a bit of a slipstream because he knew that Oscar was the driver that he wanted behind him. Lando cedes the position going into that chicane, tries again, and when you look at it, rather than going to the inside and trying to get through that way, should have, if he wanted to get a move done, go round the outside into turn one. There was way more space. Oscar was moving towards the inside, towards the pits. Lando should have gone through that way. Instead, tried to go up the inside, thought there was a gap there when there wasn't, clipped his front wing against the back of Oscar's tyre, and that was all she wrote. He was out of the race. It obviously caused a safety car, which we then finished the race under. What I will say for Lando is he was incredibly grown up about it. He accepted the responsibility right away. He was straight over the radio saying, you know, I'm sorry, it's my bad, it's my fault, it was unlucky, very stupid from me. You can tell that he was hurt, but that he knew it was his own fault. And I will say that it was always going to happen. These two were always going to come together at some point. We've been saying it now for quite a while that this was always going to happen. If McLaren is going to let these boys race and the pressure of the championship looming over them, they were always going to collide at some point. Thankfully, it wasn't a complete disaster and Oscar still managed to go on and finish the race. Will McLaren rethink the situation between Lando and Oscar? McLaren have always said that the two drivers can race, that Lando and Oscar are free to race one another, but they have always made it explicitly clear that contact between the two of them is completely unacceptable. You know, you only have to look back to Monza last year when there was the conversation that the two boys are free to race. The contact happened on turn one and Zach Brown came out and said that it was unacceptable and that the two boys were told that they were not allowed to make contact with one another. Obviously. What I will say that this collision in Canada hasn't really cost the team too much. You know, they still lead the Constructors' Championship by an absolute margin. There's like nearly 200 points between them and Mercedes. But what it has hurt is Norris's championship and McLaren's cost cap because they will have to repair the damage to Lando and Oscar's cars. I will say that the incident is unfortunate. You know, they fought hard side by side and it was clean up until that moment. It was quite an epic fight. It's just unfortunate that Norris misjudged the situation and tried to get a move done and tried to go for a gap where there was absolutely no gap. The stewards did end up getting involved. Lando got a meaningless 5-second penalty, but he didn't finish the race, but he was classified as 18th due to finishing 90% plus of the laps of the Grand Prix. So his 5-second penalty was just added to his final time, so it's not having to carry over, thankfully. But in all of this, you know, we've kind of had the threat of it in races past. It's come to a head here. Thankfully, it wasn't as bad as it could have been. Do I think McLaren will change their stance? No. I think Papaya rules will continue as they are. You are free to race, but don't make contact. And I don't think Norris will go for a move like that again. And you know, McLaren have always said that until one of the drivers is mathematically out of the championship, they will not favour either driver. So in terms of Piastri, you know, obviously he had that issue in FP3, rear puncture, broken his suspension. I will say that Piastri was pretty much nowhere throughout the opening stages of the weekend in these practice sessions. and then he just managed to completely pull it together for the qualifying session and get it on the second row. And, you know, that's what I love about Oscar is, you know, he was struggling, he knew he was struggling, but then manages to really pull it out the bag when the pressure's on. Something that Lando is struggling to do. We then obviously get to lights out, and it's an incredibly clean get off the line for all the drivers. There is a moment where Oscar and Antonelli are like too wide going into turn 3, and Oscar just sort of pulls back. And I will say I'm very glad that Oscar just didn't try and stick with it. And it just shows how mature Oscar is as a driver to cede that position and, you know, let the race come to him. It's obviously an incredibly long Grand Prix, but at that point, I do believe that Oscar was thinking, you know, I could maybe gain track position here, or I could maybe ruin it all, and I've actually got a championship battle to think about. You know, I've got bigger things, I've got a bigger picture here that I need to consider. So it was nice to see Oscar not just risking it all. I think he played a pretty smart race through the whole thing. It was amazing to watch he and Lando battling it out. And as I said, it was a completely epic fight up until those final moments at the pit straight where it all came undone. Piastri did have damage. Thankfully, we finished the race behind the safety car, so there was no real issue for him there. But yeah, it was some good, clean racing, and it was really enjoyable to watch just up until that point. What I will say is the Rosberg curse continues. We have spoken about for a couple of years now how Nico Rosberg seems to curse certain drivers or teams with his infamous pre-race selfies. He has done it in front of cars on the grid, and they have gone on to have terrible races. He has done it in front of team garages, and they have gone on to have terrible races. This time around, he did it on the pit straight, right where the accident between Norris and Piastri happened. Rosberg's got powers. He's got some supernatural shit going on there. We all joked about it. As soon as he put that selfie up, we were all on social media being like, that's it, he's cursed it, he's cursed it. We all thought it was going to be lap 1, turn 1 between George and Max. Little did we know that this whole situation between Lando and Oscar was going to happen later in the race. And all it's proving is that Nico Rosberg's selfies hold unfathomable power. But yeah, Oscar Piastri, decent race, has extended his championship lead. He's now on 198 points ahead of Lando Norris, who's on 176 points, who's ahead of Max Verstappen on 155. So there is still all to play for in this championship. We still have a long way to go. We're not even halfway yet. We are coming up for race 11 in 2 weeks' time in Austria. What I will say is this championship is hotting up, and it's only going to get more spicy as it goes on. Only going to get more and more spicy as the races take over. I think that final half of the season after the summer break is going to be fireworks, and I cannot wait. But that is everything from us. We will see you very soon for our predictions for the Austrian Grand Prix. We won't actually be here for Austria or Britain because my auntie is getting married the weekend of the Austrian Grand Prix, and then we're all going on a big family vacation over the British Grand Prix. So going to be missing them, but we will come back with a bit of a highlights video on some thoughts and feelings about the big moments throughout Austria and Great Britain when we are back from our holidays. But thank you very much. We will see you for predictions for Austria very, very soon. Enjoy the rest of your day. Love you. Bye.